I'm Gwen.
And I'm Wendy.
Welcome to Farmworker Chronicles. We are so excited to be back for Season 2 of Farmworker Chronicles. We took a bit of a break after Season 1 because we're human and life happens, but we are back and ready to kick Season 2 off.
Woohoo! So today we're going to talk about the Bracero program. This is a topic that is important to me because it's part of my family history. My two abuelitos, Antonio and Jesus, came to the United States as braceros, and thanks to them, I'm here.
That's so awesome. It's really a wild program that your grandpas were part of, and I'm glad it led to you being here. Not only is the Bracero program a part of your family history, but it's also a big part of the United States history. So for this episode, we were able to speak with Eugenio Mollo Jr., who is a law professor at University of Toledo and spoke with us about the Bracero program. Let's get into it.
Before we get started on our interview, I'd like to ask Eugenio to please introduce himself.
Hi, thank you for having me, Wendy and Gwen. My name is Eugenio Mollo. I am a clinical professor at the University of Toledo College of Law. I direct our Immigrant Justice Clinic, and the clinic operates like a lot of other law school clinics. It's basically a mini law firm within our law school. So under my supervision, law clinic students represent local community members on their immigration cases. These are real clients with real cases. It provides law students with an opportunity before they graduate to work on and improve their core lawyering skills. How to interview clients, investigate cases, assemble evidence, conduct legal research, draft declarations, appear before an adjudicator or a judge. All of the skills they're going to need when they graduate and start practicing law. So to the law students, I'm their supervisor, their co-counsel, their professor. But I'm also their mentor and their safety net. And to the clients, I'm their lawyer. It's a blend of teaching and lawyering.
What is your experience working with farm workers?
So I find it hard to believe, but exactly 20 years ago this summer, in 2004, I was a summer associate at Legal Aid of Western Ohio out of the then Fremont office. And that was my first exposure to farm workers and farm worker law. That summer exposed me for the first time to the plight of farm workers and more broadly to rural poverty. The following summer, I worked with farm workers down in North Carolina, and then after graduating from law school, I returned to Northwest Ohio to Toledo to Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, to ABLE, which is an organization I know both of you are very familiar with, and I started to represent farm workers on their legal cases. Wage theft cases, sexual harassment, immigration, of course, farm worker housing, civil rights cases. And I did that work for about 15 years before starting this full-time faculty position at the University of Toledo.
So Eugenio, you have a vast experience working with the farm worker community. And so today we wanted you to talk a little bit about the Bracero program. We've mentioned this in past episodes. And so today we wanted to give our audience, 101 of the Bracero program and its history. And can you give us an overview of the program and what prompted its creation?
Yeah, sure. So you have to take your mind back to the middle of World War II. The United States realized that it needed laborers, so the United States and Mexico negotiated a large-scale temporary worker program, the Bracero program, and it was designed to fill the wartime employment needs of the United States. Listeners might know this, but just so we're all on the same page, bracero means someone who works with his arms. Brazo means arm. Bracero comes from that word, one who works with his arms. And the program was in place for a little bit more than 20 years. It started in 1942. It ended in 1964, and during that 20-year period, between 4 and 5 million Mexican workers entered the United States under the program.
I did not realize that Bracero meant one who works with his arms. It makes sense, but I didn't put that together until you mentioned it. So, but 4 to 5 million is a lot of workers. So how did the U.S., how are they able to incentivize so many workers to come under this program?
Yeah, so the agreements between Mexico and the United States guaranteed a minimum wage. They guaranteed sanitary housing, much like the modern-day H-2A program. But also, much like the modern-day H-2A program, these terms were often under-enforced. So historians have documented widespread abuse of braceros, poor living and working conditions, racial discrimination and violence, and the use of braceros as strike breakers.
Was there a path to citizenship for farm workers under the Bracero program?
No, there was no pathway to citizenship for the braceros. I say this nicely with friends. The United States didn't want the braceros as citizens or as lawful permanent residents. The United States only wanted them as laborers. Another similar situation between how we treat H-2A workers today. There's no pathway to citizenship for H-2A workers.
So is this Bracero program still in existence, or is there some modern-day version of it?
So the Bracero program is no longer in existence. It ended in 1964. But people have drawn comparisons between the Bracero program to the modern-day H-2A program. One commonality is that both programs, the Bracero program and the H-2A program, tie an individual worker specifically to the petitioning employer. The farm worker can only work with that one employer. And under the H-2A visa program, there are protections. The employer must provide free and agency-approved housing, must provide kitchen facilities, must provide reimbursement for transportation, all of this. These are very similar provisions that existed under the Bracero program. But also, as these mandates existed, they also fell short of expectations. And we know to this day, H-2A workers experience unpaid wages. They experience threats, violence, unsafe working conditions, and unsanitary housing. And migrant farm workers are weary of reporting abuses, just like the Braceros did decades ago. Why? Well, they're linguistically isolated. They were being threatened of being banned from not staying in the program. They fear deportation consequences. So the program has been over, has concluded for 60 plus years now. But the interesting thing is that observers believe that the Bracero program contributed significantly to unauthorized migration in later decades, because migration patterns established under the Bracero program simply continued after the program ended.
So, Eugenio, what ended up happening to all these workers?
They continued on their migration patterns. So it's important to look at the history of this. If we're going to ask ourselves, wow, why do we have so many undocumented Mexican people in the United States? Part of your analysis needs to look at the Bracero program, right? You want to look at these historical migration patterns. You want to look at these strong transnational networks between employers and employees. And you want to look at the United States' robust demand for foreign workers. If you take a look at these issues, you shouldn't be scratching your head for too long wondering why we have so many undocumented Mexican workers in the United States. The Bracero program contributed to this.
Was the Bracero program the first of its kind, or had the U.S. brought workers from Mexico before this?
So the U.S. has brought in workers from Mexico before this. And one common theme over this, let's call it roughly a 100-year plus history of the United States bringing in Mexican laborers, the common trend is that the United States likes this relationship to be flexible. That's the key word, flexible. The United States brought in a lot of Mexican laborers during and after World War I. And then the Great Depression hits, and the United States deported or repatriated up to 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans. That's really important. Upwards of 60% of the people removed during the Great Depression were U.S. citizens. It's a really shameful part of our history that I think doesn't get adequate attention. That's what happened during the Great Depression to Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And then we're in World War II, and that's where the Bracero program originates. And out of the Bracero program, we see the modern-day H-2A program. And then, during the Bracero program in the mid-1950s, maybe you've heard of this operation before. We saw, again, mass expulsions and roundups of Mexican laborers during what's called Operation, I won't say the word, but it's spelled Wetback. I view it as a slur. I won't say it. But it was the United States rounded up, expelled, removed, and rounded up Mexican laborers during this period. So throughout this 100-plus year history, the key word, again, is flexible. The United States welcomes Mexican laborers during periods of high demand. Why? Well, because they're so close and they're so easy to get in. But also, we remove them. Why? Because they're so close, they're easy to get out when the demand wanes. Okay, so looking at this flexibility is one of the ways to view this relationship between the United States and Mexican laborers.
Has there ever been any effort to create a pathway to citizenship for farm workers based on their status as farm workers?
The answer is yes. Over the years, there have been immigration reform proposals, and many of them include a special pathway for agricultural workers, recognizing their unique contributions to the U.S. economy. But Congress hasn't yet been able to pass anything in this area.
Eugenio, is there one big takeaway from all of this? I know we've covered a lot in a short amount of time, but if there's one big takeaway that you want listeners to have from this conversation today, what would that be?
I think it's the recognition that our immigration system, for the most part, shuts out many immigrants who don't have a qualifying family member or a high level of formal education. There are only a few ways in which someone can qualify for a green card: a family petition, an employer petition, a humanitarian route, and through something called the diversity visa lottery. There is no pathway for being in the United States as a loyal guest worker every season for the past 20 years. There's no pathway for you. There's no pathway to citizenship for H-2A visa holders, for guest workers. They're non-immigrants. The way that we justify this in our immigration laws is by saying that the deal you made with the United States is that we want you to come in, we want you to work, and we want you to leave. That's the deal you made with the United States. So again, we see to this day that the United States wants this relationship between the country and the laborers that it brings in to be flexible. We want you when we want you, and we don't want you when the demand has waned.
Right. Kind of an unwillingness to fully embrace the population, just their labor, but not the people.
Right. It's not an integration-based system. It's just purely based on your labor.
Thanks, Eugenio. I appreciate you coming in and providing an overview of the Bracero program. I think this helps inform and provide a lot of context to past episodes, but also future episodes that we will be having here on Farmworker Chronicles. And I know you provided your big takeaway, but is there anything else that you feel that we may have left out of this conversation that needs to be stated?
This is an immigration takeaway, which is related to farm workers, is that I would challenge listeners to look back at your own family's migration story. And in that process, you might feel a sense of responsibility to extend understanding and compassion to farm workers and immigrants. And I think it's important that we're constantly reminded of that in our lives.
Thank you, Eugenio.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Farmworker Chronicles.
And thanks to Eugenio Mollo Jr. for being our guest for this episode.
We are your hosts and producers, Wendy and Gwen.
Our executive producer is Chris Pfeiffer.
If you want to join the conversation, go to wgte.org/FWC. Until then, I'm Wendy.
And I'm Gwen, reminding you to thank a farm worker. Bye.
Bye.
WGTE. Voices around us.
WGTE is supported in part by the American Rescue Plan Act funds allocated by the City of Toledo and the Lucas County Commissioners and administered by the Arts Commission.